and welcome everyone to the 26th edition of the Time of the Ruyter Festival held by the Centre for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm based here at the centre just for the stint, and it's a great privilege to be here. And joining me, which is also equally a great privilege, is to talk to the investigative journalist at News 24, Kyle Cowan, who's written this fascinating book called Sabotage, which is top of everyone's minds given the extent of load shedding, with a little bit of temporary relief, which I'm sure Kyle will want to touch on in a little bit. But welcome, Kyle, and thanks very much for joining us, and welcome to everyone who's watching this live. Just as a small rider, Kyle is not physically in Durban because he's afraid or because he's been hushed or he's been threatened, but merely because he had other commitments. So there's no fears around what Kyle has written. And he also stands by what he has written, Kyle. Am I right? You're not prepared to back down on anything that you put out in space?
Not even a little bit.
So welcome, Kyle. And just to introduce Kyle very quickly, he's the investigative journalist at News 24. He's been in the game for quite some time. He's won 2 Taco Caper Awards, and so he's justifiably an award-winning journalist, and now an author.
Yeah, and I decided to tell my story in a bit of a longer format this time.
And it's a new and interesting sort of long-form journalism. But Kyle, I was actually gobsmacked at the amount of detail that you had to wade through. How did you construct a narrative out of all of this kind of sinews of processes within procedures and procedures within larger regulatory frameworks and mountains of data? I mean, how did you get through all of that while holding down a full-time job?
Yeah, so I'm lucky in the sense, Ebrahim, that my full-time job forces me to deal with Eskom on a daily basis as well. And as part of the investigations team at News 24, we had written extensively about Eskom throughout 2021. And it was a logical step to make to write the book. But we had to move away from, the sort of, so the news cycle is, if anyone who's ever worked in journalism knows, the news cycle moves enormously fast. So very important stories are often lost in the noise. I wouldn't call it noise, but I would say the overwhelming flood of day-to-day information about other equally as important things. And having had this experience of reporting on Eskom for a long time, but intensively for just a little over a year, we wrote a series of stories, I think more than 60 stories called, under the Eskom files. And I made that small step to write the book about Eskom. Mentally, it's different because to write a book, there have to be protagonists and characters, and you have to try and tell a story in a way that isn't bland and isn't difficult to consume. And that was the main thing about this. Eskom is enormously complex, and as you've pointed out, there's just processes within processes and issues upon issues. And the book, I think, is probably about 35% of the information that I wanted to convey. It was an exercise in editorial dictatorship by my publishers, I think I could say. They reined me in. Some of these chapters would have been, I think, about 100 pages long had they let me have free rein. And I think the finished product is much better for it. It's very concise. I think the book is easily readable, and it deals with these complex issues. And I'll be upfront about it. My editor, wonderful Bronwyn, she helped me enormously to make these complex issues very consumable. And it's given me a lot of, a lot of insight into packaging information around Eskom better. When you write a news story, it's a different game altogether. But the end purpose is the same. So all the book did was give me a greater scope for that, and give me an opportunity to introduce elements that wouldn't have necessarily been important to readers of News 24.
That's interesting. I mean, that's really interesting. What grabs me though is, even though the book's eminently readable, it's not sort of weighed down by too much onerous detail, so you can actually follow the story. But I'm glad to say that your editors reined you in for good reason and with great purpose, because it actually is a bit hard sometimes to start following the detail, particularly when you get into the technical stuff. But I don't want to get into the technical stuff just yet. What makes this so interesting is the kind of bio vignettes that you've pointed out of your key protagonists, and I would identify probably 4 of them, but there's 3 who I'm really interested in. The first is Mr. Oberholzer, which is the COO of Eskom, and then, as everyone knows, Mr. Ruyter, who by the way, if we can just take an aside before we return to this bio-potted vignettes, did any of the revelations that has now seen Mr. Ruyter have to leave early or resign, as is the formal story, but we know probably was pushed, did any of that revelations in the ENCA, now infamous ENCA interview, come to you as a surprise or a shock? I would imagine not.
No. The fact that they are organized syndicates extracting money from Eskom is, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. What has surprised me, however, is the reaction to it, particularly by the ANC as a political party, acting, I think with quite a lot of hypocrisy and arrogance in trying to claim that, the party isn't involved in corruption and so on and so forth. And the arguments around that have been quite conceited. I think that Secretary General of the ANC, Fakir has come out and said, oh, well, there's no evidence that the ANC as an organization is corrupt. No one in the ANC has sent people. He's trying to portray it as individuals doing what individuals do. And I think it's an argument that can only be bred of the pressures of a looming election. It is something that, at the beginning of the year, when I saw some of the pronouncements from the ANC around Eskom and the power crisis and so on, I actually said to my editor, Peter de Toy, the ANC has now moved from this sort of semi-state of paralysis / trudging along the same old route, sort of lethargically, to desperation. And I said to him, this desperation, because they know Eskom is going to hurt them at the polls. Loadshedding is going to be a major deciding factor in the polls next year. And I said to him, they're now desperate. And this makes me more worried, because desperation makes people do strange things. Like, imagine adopting a legal strategy to try and force someone to divulge information that puts your entire political party in a bad light 12 months before an election, when roughly, I don't know, let's say argument's sake, 40 million out of the 60 million people living in South Africa do not find it at all strange to think that the ANC may be involved in corruption. Then there's the added little, sort of important note to that, is that there's sufficient evidence to show that the party has been, people within the party and the party itself have been either party to or involved in corruption at Eskom over the past 20 years. It's not a surprise, but the reaction was surprising.
Well, we've got roughly 4,000 pages which testify to that fact after the Zondo Commission report. But I just wanted to draw your attention to a little bit of gossip, which is something you hint at, just staying on the story of the media before we come to these bio profiles. And I want to read the short extract about it's very early on in the book where you talk about why there's no surprise that there was a call for the heads either of Oberholzer or Andre de Ruyter. And you say, de Ruyter, Oberholzer, and the new Eskom board, led by Professor Makgoba, had faced repeated calls for their heads, usually after seemingly orchestrated leaks intended to discredit them, and they've been maligned by certain media houses with half-baked conspiracy theories masquerading as journalism. You mind telling us who you think that is?
It's the independent group of newspapers. I mean, let's be honest about it. I being involved in day-to-day reporting around Eskom, you obviously read a lot of news as well. You read a lot of the reporting, and it's just astounding how journalists would allow themselves to be used. They get this. There's particular examples around Econ Oil, which I also deal with extensively in the book, where and the Daily News springs to mind now as it's a paper that those residents of KZN should be very familiar with, and they publish these extraordinary stories about the Ruyter and this fight with Econ Oil, and none of it's true. Like the fact that someone has opened a criminal case against someone else doesn't mean that that person is a criminal, but the newspaper reports it as if he is some kind of, devious character sitting on top of the sprawling empire of racism and discrimination, and that's just, to me, the reason why I particularly, and I must caveat this, the original draft of the manuscript, or specifically around that section, you can imagine it wasn't as diplomatically worded as that extract that you just read out. And I think the lawyers had a thing or two to say about, there are things like defamation laws and things that I have to be careful of, and it was, it was made a little bit more streamlined, shall we say, and but it's just following what's happened over the past 3 years at Eskom. So you get to know of something, because as a good journalist, I speak to my sources regularly. You get to know something, and then 6 months down the line, after you've spent 6 months investigating this and people's motives and so on, and following legal processes around it, you see these stories published in other newspapers, and it's so obvious that, this union person or this disaffected party has now leaked that information, and the newspaper just ran with it. They didn't question it. They didn't pick up a telephone, because they are predetermined to be antagonistic towards the CEO of Eskom and so on. And this is something I've said before as well. People have accused me, in writing this book, have accused me of defending Oberholzer and Ruyter simply because they're white. Now, we don't have to get drawn into the ridiculousness of that argument, but what I say to people who say these things to me is, do you honestly think I didn't spend my time first verifying, checking, making sure, understanding who these individuals are before, I decided to interview them for my book? It's as simple as that. We looked at them, we couldn't find any issues, and then we started speaking to people, and we realized that they were genuinely trying to turn Eskom around.
And I mean, you do point out, so the fact that I've drawn you out and who you were alluding to in this, and the lawyers thought you might need some protection so that you're not on sticky ground. The reality here is that I think we are now clearly fairly safe. And the reason we are is I could get you and draw you out on that because, as you point out later in the book, there have been specific investigations, 4 in the case of Oberholzer and 5 in the case of the Ruyter, including investigations by SCOPA, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. And each one of them, in every instance, of whether it's allegations of racism, whether it's malafide intention on the basis of internal investigations, they've been cleared on every one of those. So 9 investigations in total, and they've been cleared on either one. And so the ones who are reporting this would actually have no case to stand on. But regardless, Kyle, let's return to this question of the characters, and you've mentioned 2 of them, but there's a third who I'm interested in, which we can come to later, is Soli Chitangano, the Chief Procurement Officer. You draw a small vignette of him too, but certainly the most extensive ones of Oberholzer and of the Ruyter. And I mean, I'm fascinated by how you managed in this long form journalism, which is investigating malfeasance, corruption, looking at data, creating a case or weaving a narrative around this. Why did you think it was important to kind of showcase these guys as individuals, as people, their background, what they studied, how they think?
Yeah. So in the course of working, as a journalist around Eskom, you are approached on a daily basis with stories about people, and I can say this about former CEOs, current senior managers. I get approached and people say to me, oh, you know what this and this person did? You'll never believe it. They did this and that, and they said this, and they do these kind of things and that kind of thing. And very early on, when we started working on the Eskom files at News 24, I spoke to an Eskom source that I had known previously, and this person whom I trust said to me, this guy is doing good. He's trying. They're figuring some stuff out, and they've obviously just jumped in the deep end of a pool, and they're only realizing it now. But things are looking okay. This person said something and so on forth. So you learn to know these people. You get to know them a little bit from afar as you do your day-to-day reporting, because in any institution or organization, a lot of people love nothing more than to tell tales on the management of said institution or organization. And a lot of what we were hearing was positive. There was obviously a lot of serious allegations of racism and discrimination and all this kind of stuff. And we looked at it, and we started looking at it. And I think that what I realized, and that's why the book, the title of the book, the subtitle is Eskom Under Siege. Because what I realized was that these two individuals are the tallest trees, let's be clear. But there is a forest around them. And what I realized is that everyone at Eskom who was trying to do the right thing, whether they were the COO or the CEO or a senior manager or an anonymous employee at a power station, whenever they try and do the right thing, they're either worked out, vilified in the media, or investigated for spurious allegations of corruption or whatever. And it literally became over the course of 2021, I realized, these guys are actually fighting a war. That's what they're doing. They are at war with corruption. They are at war with incompetence. They are at war with the institution itself. The skills are not there. The drive and the motivation to perform better is not there. And it became important for me to understand why, especially Oberholzer. He had worked at Eskom before, and he had left and he had gone into the private sector. And many would think that once you make that jump and you realize how much better life can be away from this politically sort of disastrous place that, where there's never enough money and there's always problems and there's always drama, why on earth you would go back? And I decided to ask that question up front, and I said to both Mr. Oberholzer and Mr. Ruyter, I said to them, you've now agreed to an interview with me, and this is at your peril. So now you must sit and explain to me why you decided to take this job. What on earth possessed you? And they both of them, it came down to the same thing. It's a sense of duty, a sense of care towards the country and to Eskom. And it might sound naive if you just think about it that way, who cares about serving, but there are real patriots among us who live and sacrifice every day to do jobs that no one else wants to do. And we often forget that in the wash of incompetence and greed and corruption. We forget that there are still genuinely concerned people who work for the government who are trying to do the right thing. And it was important to highlight that.
And one of the most telling things, of course, to me was Oberholzer, who tells you quite clearly that he worked there for 20 years and then he had a break when he went to the private sector and then came back after not a very significant period. But the one interesting thing that I found was it wasn't dismay. It wasn't even disappointment, because those are a bit strong, but it's this kind of wonder. How would it have been? Because just by the way, Oberholzer's father also worked at Eskom.
That's right.
How would it have been? Had his one son, he says, got 3 children, right? One's autistic, but the other two, one was a geologist, one who's actually in engineering. Why would they not consider working at Eskom? Because it's been a career path for people in his family. And today you were talking about how we've got journalism which is crafting narratives, not providing facts, which is interesting for people who are interested in writing, but also in kind of narrating. And, narrating stories is very different from narrating facts. So there's a place for both. But in this kind of gig economy where people believe, well, anyone who's been in a job for more than a few years is kind of looked at as cunts. But the interesting thing that Oberholzer pushed out was this question of institutional stability, which only comes about not because of processes, procedures, and regulations, but because of the people who are in there and know how to navigate them. And what struck me was most of the developed nations have done so on the basis of people being in public service or in the civil service more properly for extended periods of time. Was he, what, I mean, do you think he was disappointed when he was reflecting on whether his children would end up in Eskom or not?
Yes, he was. You know, I asked him directly, you know, especially his son who's an engineer. I said to him, well, are you going to encourage him to get a job at Eskom, you know? And he said, no, in the current climate, he cannot see that that's a good idea for him, you know? And it's disheartening. Because it's, you know, Eskom as an institution is a highly technical space. Everything about it is technical, but at the same time, as you say, if you don't have, you know, I can't even remember how many times I've heard stories about old ooms who could walk the turbine hall of the power station where they'd worked at for 40 years. And they could, just by listening, tell you that this unit or that unit was busy doing something funny, you know. And the problem is, and it's something that we don't openly talk about enough, I think, the problem is that with the dawn of democracy, there came an urgent and necessary need to rectify the economic exclusion of the majority of South African citizens. And what happened at Eskom was this sort of aggressive implementation of that transformation. And a lot of these skilled individuals walked out without carryover processes, without an agreement saying, okay, we have to achieve certain transformation targets. You have been identified as a person who will stand in the way of us meeting those targets because you are white, but you've worked for Eskom for 30 years. So we're not just going to let you run out of the door. If you want to take a voluntary separation package, which we'll offer to you, you can take it now and walk out of the door. But if you stay for another 2 years and train 3 people, and that's all you do is you train them to do the job that you've been doing, we'll give you 10% on top 2 years later. That was not done. So 4,000, I think the last estimate was 4,000 people left Eskom. And, you know, I wrote about it quite recently. There's this fascinating study from within Eskom that showed that in the generation division, the division responsible for actually running the power stations, less than 1% of people who are in technical roles aspire to remain in those roles. And I think the reason for this is manifold. If you look at the impact of corruption on Eskom, a lot of it is monetary. It's always people think, oh, money, 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 because that's the bottom line, really. That's the headline figures. But think of the honest, down-to-earth engineer who has no political aspirations, doesn't need to buy a Bentley to feel important, is happy to drive his 2005 Hilux for the rest of his life, and is happy to work at the same power station as long as his kids can go to a good school, etc., for the rest of his career. And that person arrives at work one day and he's faced with 3 individuals who tell him that if he does not allow a certain contract to go a certain way, you know, your kids go to the school, your wife works here, we'll make sure that you get taken care of. That person who has worked for Eskom for 20 years does one of 2 things. They either comply and thereby morally just feel degraded and scared because they are now party to a crime, or they do the sensible thing. They pack their children in their bag and their house up, and they move to a place where they can earn double the money with less stress. And that's a lot of that has happened at Eskom. So understanding that skills have walked out of the door, and with that, it's opened a space for people who are inexperienced and or people who are corrupt. That's key.
And you kind of pointed out in the way in which it's very quick for people who've been there for quite some time, you know, understand how the business, to pick out how someone's either trying to manipulate them or kind of cut corners or buck the regulatory infrastructure and so on. They pick it up very quickly. But what struck me towards the end, I mean, one of the and I would use the word advisedly, but I think it's true. One of the evil protagonists is this guy, Mr. Soli Chitangano. But you do point out that for a great degree of weeks, he actually was trying to get this, what you've referred to already, Econ Oil, back in line, because they weren't sticking to the technical specifications and the technical birds, and they didn't have contracts with suppliers, so there was no reliable supply coming from them. So you chronicle how extensively he'd written to them, given them deadlines, told them what to do right, threatened them even. What suddenly turned?
It's a question that still bugs me, because unfortunately, Mr. Chitangano did not want to engage with me in a very open way when I asked him some questions about this. So to be frank, it was limited to an exchange of questions via email, and it's not the way I prefer to do things, but it's unfortunately how it turned out with Mr. Chitangano, who, for the record, was a well-respected civil servant, someone who stood in the path of major corruption, and was honored for it. What changed?
He was.
I don't know. It's weird. It's a, as you say, he had tried to keep everything in line. I think, and this is my opinion, what changed was he had started to falter in other parts of his job. And when management wanted to enforce performance and say, listen, we need more from you, we need better from you, I think that's where the disconnect happened. And then Mr. Chitangano went into protection mode, self-preservation mode. And that's the genesis of a lot of this. It's strange. He accuses Andre de Ruyter of racism in one of his original complaints, but when he was actually interviewed by the advocate who led the independent investigation, he denied it. He said he never called him a racist.
And that's curious, because that advocate is a very senior, seasoned. It's advocate Semenya, senior counsel, right? Who then actually says that this allegation, in his report, he says that, and you point this out in the book, the allegations were literally spurious. And this is not us saying. Mr. Semenya says that this is using race as an instrument of political capital. And you've alluded to that question of race, right? I mean, to what extent is this being used? Is it just operatives who are in process roles who, because they're not sticking to the technical specifications of the job, are found wanting and then use race? Or is it higher order politicians? But the one thing that's obvious is that everyone's using race as a instrument of political capital, but no one wants to solve it as a constructed social problem.
Yeah, that's the story of South Africa at the moment, isn't it? We, as a country, have not healed from the wounds of the past. Reparations are underway, but I think that the majority of South Africans living now, because they remain living in poverty, they remain living in a country where opportunities are few and far between. They are faced with the same doom and gloom and the cynicism that we, who are active participants in the economy, are faced with, albeit on a much more tangible daily scale for people who cannot afford to buy a loaf of bread, right?
Right,
so,
but isn't that, Kyle? Isn't that a question of, as your book, and this is the big narrative arc for me, is that reparations aside, the question of fundamental redistribution in society actually happens when places like Eskom function optimally. Yeah,
correct.
But what are they? So I have clues, and I take those from your book. But what do you think is the purpose of the stuff that's going on in Eskom? Because it's not about making Eskom efficient, optimal, and effective. It's about satisfying some other kind of policy goal, and one can't even always call it a policy goal. But nevertheless, what do you think that's about?
I think it all comes down to unchecked, rampant corruption. The the disparate groups and personal interests being pursued in and around Eskom, which is government's single largest procurer on an annual basis, has led to the effect that the institution is rotten. I don't think that there is a contract at Eskom that isn't in some way, shape, or form tainted by either corruption or malfeasance, or and let's be completely honest about this. The impact of corruption on Eskom is something that we as a country do not fully comprehend yet. I have grappled with this issue on many occasions, especially also when writing the book, is how do you convey to people how an institution has become so battered and bruised and broken by, I mean, there are countless examples. And whether those are all interconnected or not, I don't always believe they are. I think it's people acting for their own interests wherever. And the cumulative damage that causes, the cumulative problems that causes, because think about it, if you're a senior manager responsible for buying spares for a power station, and your sole quest in life is to make 300, 400,000 Rand on every transaction, you're not focusing on the job at hand. You're not getting the best deal for Eskom. You are not necessarily even buying things that Eskom needs at that point in time. And it's that lack of control. It has just spiraled into a situation where it has become too big, too widespread to fix or pull back.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, do you reckon that there's a higher order purpose being served by this, and this is kind of create and use Eskom as a vehicle to kind of reach the policy goal of Black economic empowerment? And Black economic empowerment, you can have your ethical questions around what it seeks to do, but it's about creating this class of it's class mobility of a very kind of supersonic type. So ascendancy is immediate, accumulation is large. I mean, do you think there may be an element of that? And if that's the case, then this is not about redistribution or functionality of the society. It's about reaching some other kind of goal of creating a particular class.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting, question. It's something that I've thought about, but not in the way that you've posed the question. I've thought about it in this way. I've thought about it in terms of the technical impact on Eskom itself. The impact on Eskom's ability to deliver services, well, its core function, to make electricity, to make and supply electricity. And it's very clear to me that supply development and localization policies, transformation policies, have hurt Eskom. Not because of the mere fact that the policies exist, but because of the way that they were implemented. And as you say, the sort of supersonic, aggressive, very quick, shift everything over, get it done, check the box, file the report, get a bonus. That's what it boils down to.
But yeah, we're not even talking about class formation, right? We're talking about basic extraction and accumulation. Yeah. I mean, Econ Oil benefited to the degree of over 8 years, overcharging Eskom 139 billion.
13.9. No, 1.3, sorry, billion.
1.3 billion, sorry, 1.3 billion. But that's a quantum which is not, that's not a quantum of empowerment. That's a quantum of supersonic accumulation, as I call it. And the reason I'm asking you this question is because I think that there's a fundamental conflict between that and this policy goal, right? Because just tell us a little bit about how people who want to get Eskom actually working, both Black and white, men and women, or intersex these days. Let me be absolutely correct. So they're all trying to get Eskom working, but they tell us how they're distracted from doing so. I mean, you hint at spurious kind of internal investigations, proceedings, people distracted from actually doing their work.
Yeah, so there's the base distraction of people actually being involved in the corruption, being involved in the extraction, and their priorities are, where will I spend Christmas with my family? Seychelles or Mauritius, with all the stolen money that I've got? Will I buy a Bentley or will I buy a McLaren? Will I buy a nice Audi that can fly under the radar, or am I going to splurge a bit and go for a purple Lamborghini? These are the kind of things, in my mind, that people start thinking about, because your style of life becomes different. Suddenly you are no longer eating at Wimpy, you're going to Tasha's every morning for breakfast. That's the kind of, and that lifestyle requires upkeep, it requires maintenance, it requires cash in the bank. And to keep cash in the bank, you are more worried about, where can I cut a deal here, what can I do that, and the core purpose of your job disappears. Some of it gets done, but not all of it. So in terms of senior management at Eskom, for example, Andre de Ruyter arrives at Eskom, and let's stick to the Econ Oil example, because it's the one I know the best, and I've actually had a chance to speak to people about. He arrives at Eskom having worked for Sasol in the past. He knows that Eskom procures enormous amounts of fuel oil, always have procured it from Sasol. He knows it's an area where Eskom can save a considerable amount of money. And here he comes with all of that institutional knowledge of having worked at Sasol. He knows where Eskom can potentially, beat Sasol down a bit and get some more, or the fuel oil suppliers, where they can make the supply chain a little bit more streamlined, where they can cut some costs. He immediately realizes that there's problems, major problems, with the previous tender and the tender that was then under consideration, another 5-year deal. So he sets about investigating, and he finds out, there's potential collusion here, there's potential corruption here. I think we should cancel the tender, and let's just cancel it and start all of this from the beginning. We need to be sure that we're not signing ourselves into another deal for 5 years with a company that has effectively been stealing money from Eskom. When he tries to do that, he is accused of discrimination against black-owned companies, that he's anti-transformation, that he has defamed and lied in public about the owner of the same company, and a criminal case is registered against him. His own chief procurement officer eventually uses this to try and get rid of him and to protect himself. And he spends 2 years trying to cancel one tender. It costs Eskom millions in legal fees. He personally is consumed by this thing, answering questions, filing affidavits, getting this done, being interviewed by the police. For 2 years, he has to deal with this issue, just because there was some corruption and some overcharging around one tender. And remember, Eskom spends 100 billion rand a year. So the scale of the problem becomes enormous.
Yeah, I mean, so these people are distracted. There's kind of investigations going on. There's processes happening, and they, instead of doing their core work every day, are busy responding to these things, involved in providing affidavits, evidence, discovery, going through documents, and all of that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. So they're not actually doing their real everyday work. The interesting thing for me is Econ Oil, you point out, started off as a project in Sasol. So Econ Oil was selling Sasol's oil to Eskom. What was Econ Oil doing then?
So Eskom had transformation targets that it needed to meet. And it just so happens that the owner of Econ Oil was lucky enough to meet a very senior Eskom person, Thandi Mara, who worked in the procurement of fuel oil and various other things, but specifically fuel oil as well. And she met her at a conference, I believe, in Durban, in 2002 or 2003, and that unlocked a gateway for both of them, I believe. And Mlonzi, Notembo Mlonzi, who's the owner of Econ Oil, enormously smart woman, she realized that she doesn't have the infrastructure, nor, she doesn't own a refinery or anything like that, but there is an opportunity here. And in fact, Eskom was encouraging people to get involved in this space. So she took that encouragement and she took that opportunity and for a while actually worked out of offices based at Sasol. And Sasol was happy to do it because they can continue to make money selling fuel oil to Eskom. Now there's just an intermediary in between. And Eskom's happy because now they can say, we are helping to create an example, a very good example of a Black woman-owned business that is doing enormously well, and paint this whole facade that, you know, that someone is actually learning something, that industry is actually being created, that commerce is actually going to spread from this. Whereas in fact, what Econ Oil did, and they are vehement about this probably because it's true, but in court papers, even Econ Oil is very, very agitated when De Ruyter and Eskom called them a middleman. Econ Oil took that very, very badly, and, you know, wanted it. I believe I speak under correction, but actually wanted that struck out of the court record, because it's true, you know. And in Econ Oil's defense, they did invest in infrastructure. They did build their own blending plant in Mpumalanga. But it's not, you know, if Econ Oil, for example, loses the Eskom contract, right, I believe it'll be an existential threat to the continued existence of the business. So it is a parasite that is sitting on Eskom. What we need to ask is that policy that allowed that company to exist and just feed off of Eskom, while the intellectual property, the skills, the expertise is being created elsewhere, is whether that is, as you said earlier, truly fulfilling our policy goals. And it isn't. It patently isn't. But what can we do about it? Because as soon as you question it, even on, not on racial grounds or in terms of those, even if you just question it on the grounds of it may be corrupt, you get accused of racism. You know. But
isn't it fascinating, Kyle? You mentioned the date, and I was going to come to that if you didn't, because it's in the book, right? 2003. In 2003, the people everyone loved to hate, President Jacob Zuma, was not in fact in power when this whole kind of thing starts to happen, right? And who is?
Thabo Mbeki.
And it links directly back to this whole sort of thing. So the reality is that the 1996 class project, or a class project, was real. But the reality of the class project was not so much about ascendancy of people from one class to another. This is about, I have no idea. It's about creating super wealthy oligarchs. I mean, are we in the process of constructing oligarchs, or are we in the business of redistribution and new class formation, class mobility?
I think you know the answer to that question. It's
I'd like to join it.
Yeah, it's you know, there's a fundamental problem with allowing theft, wholesale theft, to happen like this, is that you don't even come close to redistribution or economic access or skills supply or skills development or anything like that. It becomes a facade very quickly because, number one, it's not even concentrated in a certain small space. So we can't even argue that we're making a handful super wealthy, which did happen. But we can definitely not argue that it's wholesale and it's being felt across the board, and the economy is doing better for it, and households are doing better, and a whole generation will do better because of it. Because once these guys figured out how to extract money from Eskom, they jealously protect that territory. People do not get involved in corruption because they're philanthropists. And this is the problem. So at what point do you recognize that systemically, simply appointing suppliers for the very fact that their directors are Black is damaging Eskom?
Yeah.
You know,
but
that's the problem.
I mean, this is a lot of kind of malfeasance, right? That's for real. We've covered that, but there's a extent to which you point out fairly adequately how it's not just malfeasance, but it's also maladministration. And there's a fourth character who is now since passed, Mr. Chetia, and I mean, this is about someone just not doing their job properly.
Yeah, I mean that's what it comes down to. Mr. Chetia, you know, and I said this earlier in another engagement I had. You know, I have enormous sympathy for him. I think that he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He was caught between the interests of a grouping that wanted to extract money and the sort of new regime that wanted to fix things at Eskom and were driving to fix things. And unfortunately for Mr. Chetia, he found himself involved in a portfolio that required enormous amounts of, can we say, street smarts. You know, when you're dealing with major procurement like this, you need to be a diplomat and a cage fighter at the same time in South Africa. And I think that Mr. Chetia found himself in a very difficult position, and he didn't handle it very well. And he decided to basically, I think, abandon any attempt at the job. And that's what led to all of these allegations that he made.
But Kyle, you reckon there's some, I mean, was there some kind of personal stuff going on between individuals? I mean, so, you know, on the one hand, sure, there's major malfeasance. On the other, there's just simple maladministration, incompetence, sloth, laziness, etc. So that's the second category of things. Is there a third category of things where people just have personal gripes and, you know, I just don't smart for Kyle Cowan, so I'm going to finger him?
Definitely.
Is that kind of thing going on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and you can imagine Jan Oberholzer is he's let's be frank about this. He's an older white man. He's Afrikaans, so he is very forceful, very direct, and generally does not have a lot of patience. Especially, you know, think about someone who has worked at Eskom for so many years, who is used to things functioning a certain way, coming back and then finding that a thing that used to take half a day to get done now takes 3 weeks. Imagine the levels of frustration that builds up within that. And then he lashes out. And, you know, at one point, you know, Chetia had filed a grievance against Oberholzer for the way that he had spoken to him. Right. And once you get to that point, you can sort of understand that the relationship is not going great. And Oberholzer apologized to him, but said to him, the one thing I will never apologize for is putting pressure on you to do your job. And then you have to start questioning, you know, and he said to Mr. Chetia, he said to him, maybe you need to start thinking about whether or not you're cut out for this job. Wow. And Chetia took enormous offense at that and filed a complaint against him. And, you know, in the private sector, this is how it works. If I do not perform, my boss will come to me and say to me, "Ooh, we're very concerned about your performance." If I don't change tack and improve, they'll give me a handshake and ask me to leave. It's that simple. In the public sector,
basically what Chetia wanted was that he wanted Oberholzer not to do his job, right? And overlook my cut performance, basically.
Yeah, basically, and say to and be your friend and just sort of help you muddle through all of this. And then there's the added sort of caveat to all of this is that I do not believe that Mark Chetia was appointed into that position. And remember, he was appointed before we also came back to Eskom, before the Ruyter. I do not believe he was appointed for any skills that he possessed or anything like that. I believe he was appointed with a nefarious agenda in mind by certain individuals who have now since been arrested and charged for other corruption. And it all centers around the portfolio that Chetia was managing, the procurement of the battery energy storage system, which was highly contested at that stage, and future projects. Remember, there is a lot of, remember that when people think about stealing money, they think about 10, 15 years in advance. The good ones, the clever ones, they think about, okay, we're making a lot of money out of the coal value chain right now, but look at all this talk about just energy transitions and renewables and so on. We need to shift here. If we're going to maintain our lifestyle and what we do here, we're going to have to shift our focus. And they do that remarkably quickly. And Mr. Chetia, I think, was unfortunately as I said, caught between a rock and a hard place in that sense. And it's unfortunate that I was never able to speak to him about it. He passed before that. I could convince him to speak to me, and it's it's sad, but it's one of those. The reason why I felt it was important to keep it in the book was because at one stage, Oberholzer estimates that he was spending 40% of his work week responding to the various investigations caused by Mr. Chetia's allegations. The chief operations officer of Eskom, that's a significant amount of time.
The interesting thing is also that Oberholzer is quite ordentlich to say. I mean, he's a straight up guy. He's a ordentlich guy. Unlike the Ruyter, who was liberally given to throw in a fuck here and there. All over, which I'm glad to see was not edited out of your book. And I know we haven't spoken a lot about the Ruyter. The kind of focus is on him and so on, but you do dedicate the latter half of the book to the Ruyter and the Ruyter's role and how he comes under attack and so on. But they are all both cleared by successive investigations. Of either the allegations of racism or about targeting black suppliers or about their own incompetence. And but just, I mean, why was the Ruyter suddenly viewed as incompetent? It brings me back to a story that you narrate a little bit about his time at Nampak and how no one's looking at Nampak's performance in the context of the time where everyone believes that Africa is the rising continent, and so Nampak goes on this major expansionist drive. They leverage all their equity, and then they leverage even debt, and then they get caught with the fact that actually the continent, because of maladministration, but also because of just simple malfeasance that we've been describing, is not all that it's cut out to be in terms of the future. And that's where the business got stuck. So how did that suddenly become his problem of this guy is just incompetent?
Facts. People very seldom let facts get in the way of a good story. It's something that I find on a daily basis with my job. Because people know that I write a lot about Eskom, they'll tell me, oh, yeah, but the Ruyter is so useless. Look at all this bad load shedding we've got. Trying to explain to people why load shedding is worse now than it's ever been before. And trying to explain to them that we've taken a corrective action, and this corrective action is causing the pain. It's impossible. It's, I would say, even futile. People don't care. All they care about is that they've got hours of the day that they don't have electricity at home. Their business is being impacted by it. And then they blame the easiest person to blame. Because, of course, it's the CEO's responsibility to be at 16 power stations 24/7 all the time, standing over every single person's shoulder, making sure that they do their job in an organization that employs 40,000 people.
So fake narratives and false news are not just reserved for social media and Twitter and it seems like fake news is making its way into parliamentary committees as well.
Don't get me started on parliamentary committees, because then we're going to be here for 2 days, because the level of uselessness and incompetence that I have seen on display at these SCOPA hearings and all these other things where they question Eskom about things, it is so obviously agenda driven. And so obviously ill-informed. I mean, the chairperson of the, I believe it was the Mineral Resources and Energy Committee a couple of weeks ago, was talking about the ABB contract at Eskom at Kusile, and was saying, with pomp and ceremony and gusto and arrogance, but what is happening with consequence management? Is the senior manager still working at Eskom? My friend, that former senior manager was the acting CEO and has since been arrested and is facing charges of corruption. But you don't know that because you don't care enough to know. So it infuriates.
And that's not stuff that they get from the news, right? That's in the reports that have been commissioned by SCOPA. It's in investigative reports. It's in disciplinary hearings conducted by Nazir Kasim SC and Ismail Semenya SC and so on. Kyle, one quick, small segue. Can I call you an engineer or a physicist now? Because you're obviously into kind of all this technical stuff. There was a whole chapter where I had difficulty following the kind of technical terminology and stuff.
No, please don't call me an engineer or a physicist. I am but a lowly journalist who has only a matric certificate behind me. But what I did, Ebrahim, is I spent an enormous amount of time and effort speaking to engineers, data scientists who work at Eskom, former plant managers, reading. Just if you go on the internet and read about these technical performance statistics that are used the world over around power stations, you will find doctorates upon doctorates done on this stuff. It's ubiquitous. It is enormously difficult to understand.
But you worked out the formula and the sort of proportion between sort of energy availability factor and load undermining unavailability factors and so on. I mean,
yeah, it's not once it clicks, it's enormously complex. But once it clicks and once you get it, you get it. And then it's like it's like that math problem that your teacher was trying to explain to, and I'll be very, very open here. I did not do well with maths in school. Until I got one teacher who explained something to me in a way that it just clicked, and then suddenly I got it, and I was able to somehow pass my matric exam. Don't know how. So it's the same thing with these technical statistics, but our politicians bank on the fact that not everyone will understand all these technical sort of details around this. So whenever the ministers and the president and whoever come out and they talk about 70% energy availability factor, I laugh. Because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what this technical performance indicator is and what it should be used for. But when you try and explain this to them, then you get told, oh, well, we really don't know where you get half the stuff that you write because you're obviously on a trip, and it's quite funny. If they had invested the time in trying to understand it, they would not be on national television calling for a 70% EAF target, because then they would understand that target is damaging to the power plant in the long run.
Right, simply because that power plant is running at a point beyond which it should not, right? And that's the thing. But on this technical stuff, Kyle, I mean, this stuff between something which is the height of some kind of cooling tower. How did we end up with towers which were too short?
The boilers.
I know that you need further space for cooling off and condensation and so on.
Yeah.
But how did the builders end up with a tower which is too short? Surely this is their basic engineering calculation should have told them this is the case. This is what is needed, and instead we've got something else.
Yeah. So this is a highly fraught area that we're entering. So the problem. The problem with the boilers, right, is that the exhaust temperature is too high. Let's distill it down to its very, very basics. If you ask if you take 5 people, some who work for Eskom contractors and some who work for Eskom, and if you will ask them the same question separately, they'll give you a different reason and cause and answer. But it comes down to, I think, this: the design period for the power stations was too short, because we took too long to make a decision to start building the power stations. So that introduces pressure introduces mistakes extrapolate. And when you're talking about power stations, one small mistake today, 10 years from now, is costing you a lot of money. That's what happened here. Then also there's a problem.
And this delay is not a new thing, right? It's a decision which goes back to early 2000s, late 90s.
1998, Cabinet made a decision, approved a white paper that said by 99 they have to make a new investment decision on new power stations. 99 came and went, 2000 came and went. We only really saw action after South Africa won the 2010 FIFA World Cup in 2004, when they realized, now we've got problems, because there's going to be this influx of people and we have to build all these major facilities. And then they do the thing that has probably cost this country the most. They start building 2 massive power stations at exactly the same time, right around the time that we're building all these soccer World Cup stadiums. So all the country's civil engineering expertise and everything is spread far too thin. And that contributed to the delays. Then you've got your design defects because of the shortened and truncated design period. And now there's another problem. The quality of coal that is being burnt in Kusile's boilers specifically is also adding to the problem, you know. And this is all, it's I call it the perfect storm. Where we are right now in terms of our energy landscape, it's just the perfect storm of bad policy, corruption, slow implementation, slow reaction time, and a lack of money. It all just has come together to cause this problem.
But we're much happier now. I mean, the past 2 days, things seem to be turning around. We're looking at a lower load shedding factor, if I can use that word factor, because it sounds so nice and fancy. The messaging is suddenly changed, and what's that about, Kyle? Should we be hopeful?
Yeah, no, we should be very, very worried that the messaging is suddenly changing. What happened with Oberholzer and Ruyter, and specifically Prof. Magoba as well, the former chairperson, is they let the light shine in Eskom. They opened up, they were transparent about the problems that they were facing. We have now immediately gone back to a sort of Cold War era, guard all the secrets with our lives kind of vibe. And if anyone at Eskom tells you that they have managed to improve the performance of a power station, as what Eskom is doing right now, it's because of it's the result of years worth of work, first of all, that came before. It's also a result of some bullshit, let's be honest, because these power stations, some of them are not fixable. Some of them shouldn't be running so hard. And it's leading to a situation where we are doing exactly now what we did in 2016, 17 to make things look better, kick the can down the road and make the problem a lot worse 6, maybe 12 months from now.
So basically, in sum, what you're saying is we're taking short-term gain for much longer-term pain.
That's right.
Kyle, on that note, thank you so very much. And everyone who's watching, I encourage you to get the book. It's not an easy read. It's not an entertaining read, but it's an important one because it tells you about the toxic mix of institutional manipulation, process debasement, corruption, malfeasance, maladministration, and the perfect storm of why this toxic mix of things are explaining why our society is where it is. Thanks very much, Kyle, for taking the time to write the book, taking the time from your busy schedule and creating a narrative arc, which is actually easy to follow, despite the complications and complexities and processes within procedures and obfuscation and so on. So thanks for taking the time. Thanks to News 24 to giving you the time to write this. And of course, thanks to the Center for Creative Arts and the Time of the Ruyter Festival for having us both. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, Kyle. And I hope we'll chat to you again soon. Thank you very much. And thanks to Bash and Sakile for the technical assistance on this. And thanks for watching.